It was a day like any other in the small, sleepy town of Crestwood. Sarah Thompson had spent her morning rushing through the familiar routine she had become all too accustomed to. The alarm blared at 5:30 a.m., as it always did, piercing the otherwise silent room she had called home for the past 7 years. Her apartment was nothing special, a modest one-bedroom space that held more memories than she cared to count, some good, but most painful. She rubbed her eyes, trying to wipe away the lingering exhaustion from another restless night. Since her divorce 2 years ago, sleep had been hard to come by. The empty side of the bed was a constant reminder of the life she had lost, of the man who had promised forever, but left when times got tough. Sarah's hands were rough from years of working double shifts at the local diner, and as she moved through her small apartment, everything felt like a blur of monotony. Her job barely paid enough to cover rent, and with no real support system to rely on, every day was a struggle. She looked out the window at the overcast sky, which matched her mood perfectly. Another gray day in a gray life. She grabbed her uniform, a faded blue apron that had seen better days, and tied it around her waist before heading out the door. The streets of Crestwood were quiet as she made her way to work, the town seemingly stuck in time. Nothing ever changed here, and for most of her life, that had been comforting. But now, that same stagnation felt like a trap she couldn't escape. Sarah had never been one to dream big, but even she had once hoped for more than this. A happy marriage, a family, maybe a small house with a garden. Those dreams had faded long ago, replaced by the harsh reality of her current existence. At the diner, it was business as usual. The regulars came in, greeted her with the same small talk, and ordered the same meals they had been ordering for years. She forced a smile, going through the motions of taking orders, refilling coffee, and cleaning tables. Her mind wandered, as it often did these days. Was this all there was for her? Was this all she had to look forward to for the rest of her life? She shook off the thought, focusing instead on the next task at hand. It wasn't until her lunch break that everything started to unravel. She had just sat down with a cup of tea when her phone buzzed. It was a notification from her landlord. Confused, she opened the message, expecting the usual reminder about rent being due at the end of the month. But what she read made her heart drop. Notice of eviction. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. This had to be a mistake. She had paid her rent last month, hadn't she? Sure, she had been late a few times, but she always managed to scrape together enough to keep a roof over her head. Panic set in as she tried to call her landlord, but the call went straight to voicemail. She left a frantic message, pleading for more time, explaining that she just needed a few more days to get things in order. The rest of her shift was a blur. She could hardly focus, her mind consumed with thoughts of what she would do if she really was kicked out. Where would she go? Who could she turn to? She had no close family left. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she hadn't spoken to her brother in years. As for friends, well, those had been few and far between since the divorce. She had always been a bit of a loner, but the split had isolated her even more. People in town had whispered about it, of course. They always did. Crestwood was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Sarah's failed marriage had been prime gossip for months. By the time her shift ended, she was no closer to finding a solution. She walked home slowly, dreading what she might find when she got there. Sure enough, there was a piece of paper taped to her door when she arrived. A formal notice of eviction, with bold letters spelling out her fate. Her stomach churned as she unlocked the door and stepped inside for what could very well be the last time. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Sarah sat down on the couch, her mind racing. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her circumstances. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to break down. She had been through worse. She could figure this out. She had to. But as the hours ticked by, the reality of her situation became harder to ignore. She had no money, no place to go, and no one to help her. By midnight, She had packed a small bag with her most essential belongings, a few changes of clothes, her mother's old locket, and a picture of her parents from when she was a child. Everything else would have to be left behind. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the bag, feeling a sense of finality that she couldn't shake. The next morning, she left the apartment for the last time. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a faint golden light over the town. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the chilly morning air, and looked around. Everything seemed so normal, so quiet. It was as if the world hadn't even noticed that her life had just fallen apart. She walked aimlessly for hours, not knowing where to go or what to do. The weight of her situation pressed down on her with every step. She thought about heading to a homeless shelter, but the idea filled her with dread. The shelters were crowded, and she had heard horror stories about theft and violence. No, that wasn't an option. She needed somewhere safe, somewhere out of sight where she could figure out her next move. That's when she saw it, the abandoned house. It sat at the edge of town, tucked away behind overgrown trees and vines. The locals had always told stories about it, saying it was haunted or cursed, but Sarah had never paid much attention. Now, though, it felt like a lifeline. She stood in front of the house, staring up at its weathered facade. The windows were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the roof looked like it could collapse at any moment. But despite its appearance, the house called to her. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the rusty gate and made her way up the overgrown path. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the front door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Was she really going to do this? Was she really going to stay in a house that everyone else in town avoided? The alternative was sleeping on the street, and that was something she couldn't bear to think about. She turned the knob, and the door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the empty house. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the rising sun through the broken windows. Sarah stepped inside, her shoes crunching on the debris scattered across the floor. The house was silent, eerily so. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed magnified in the stillness. She explored cautiously, moving from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The house had clearly been abandoned for years, maybe decades. Furniture was still in place, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if the people who had once lived there had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. A sense of unease settled over Sarah, but she pushed it aside. She had no other choice. This would have to do, at least for the night. As she made her way upstairs, she found a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed was still made, the faded floral quilt covered in dust. She set her bag down on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress creaking under her weight. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She lay back on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, trying to quiet her racing thoughts. She had made it through the night. But what now? What would tomorrow bring? As she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that this house held secrets, that something about this place was different. Little did she know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The first rays of morning light filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the dust-covered floor. Sarah woke up with a start, momentarily disoriented. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was, the events of the last 24 hours rushing back in a flood of painful clarity. She had slept uneasily, plagued by dreams that she couldn't quite remember, but that left her feeling drained and on edge. The house was cold and damp, and she could hear the faint sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Sitting up, Sarah rubbed her eyes and looked around the room. It was still as dilapidated and empty as it had been the night before, but in the morning light, it seemed even more forlorn. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and neglect. She shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around herself. She hadn't slept well, but at least she hadn't had to spend the night outside in the cold. That was something, wasn't it? Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous morning. She had brought a granola bar with her, the last thing she could grab before leaving the apartment. She fished it out of her bag and unwrapped it slowly, savoring each bite. It wasn't much, but it would have to hold her over for now. The thought of going back into town, of facing the people who would inevitably whisper and stare, made her chest tighten. She wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, Sarah decided to explore the house. It wasn't as if she had anywhere else to go, and the idea of spending the day wandering through Crestwood with no plan, no direction, filled her with dread. At least here, she could stay out of sight for a while, figure out her next move without anyone watching. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she walked out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The house was old, older than she had originally thought. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, the floral pattern barely visible under layers of dust and grime. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the smell of decay was stronger the further she ventured from the front door. Sarah made her way down the hallway, passing by closed doors, each one leading to a room she hadn't yet explored. She hesitated in front of one door, her hand hovering over the knob. For some reason, this door felt different from the others. There was an almost tangible sense of heaviness in the air around it, as though something waited on the other side. She shook her head, trying to dispel the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. It was just an old house after all. There was nothing to be afraid of. Still, her hand trembled slightly as she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, the windows boarded up, blocking out the sunlight. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, but when they did, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. This room was different from the rest of the house. While the other rooms had been empty, abandoned, this one seemed almost preserved. The furniture was still intact, though covered in a thick layer of dust. A large ornate mirror hung on the wall, its surface dulled by time. A small desk sat in the corner, papers strewn across it as though someone had left in the middle of writing. Sarah stepped further into the room, her curiosity getting the better of her. She approached the desk, brushing away the dust with her sleeve. The papers were yellowed and brittle, but she could still make out the faint scrawl of handwriting. It looked like letters, but the language was old-fashioned, difficult to decipher. She picked up one of the papers, her eyes scanning the words, trying to make sense of them. "Dearest Eleanor," it began, "I write to you with a heavy heart, for I fear the worst has come to pass. The secret we have long kept may soon be exposed, and with it, our downfall. I beg of you, if you receive this letter, do not return to Crestwood. It is no longer safe for you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she read the letter. Who was Eleanor? And what secret was this person referring to? She set the letter down, her mind racing with possibilities. She had never heard of anyone named Eleanor in town, and the letter looked like it was from decades ago, maybe even longer. But the mention of a secret, something so dangerous that it had forced someone to flee, what could that have been? Suddenly, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. Of course, there was no one there. Just the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But the uneasy feeling from earlier had returned, stronger this time. She could feel it in her chest, a sense of being watched, of not being alone. Trying to shake off the creeping fear, Sarah moved to the mirror. It was covered in dust, but she could see her faint reflection in the dull glass. Her face looked pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and anxiety. She wiped away some of the dust, revealing more of the surface. As she did, something caught her eye, something in the reflection that didn't belong. In the corner of the room, just behind her, there was a small door. It was barely visible, hidden in the shadows, but Sarah was sure it hadn't been there when she first walked in. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and stared at the door. It was old, even older than the rest of the house, its wood dark and splintered. A heavy iron latch kept it closed, rusted from years of neglect. Sarah took a step toward it, her pulse racing. What was behind that door? Part of her didn't want to know. She could feel it. the same heaviness in the air that had surrounded the other door. But this was stronger, almost suffocating, and yet she couldn't turn away. Something about that door called to her, pulling her in despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She reached out, her hand trembling as it closed around the cold, rusted latch. It took some effort, but she managed to lift it, the metal groaning in protest. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The smell that wafted up from below was thick and musty, the kind of smell that had been trapped for years, untouched by fresh air. Sarah hesitated at the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house and never come back. But something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain, urged her forward. She had come this far, and now that the door was open, she couldn't ignore the pull of whatever lay beneath. Carefully, she made her way down the stairs, the old wood creaking under her weight. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the darkness pressing in around her. Her hands brushed the rough stone walls as she descended, using them to steady herself in the dim light. When she finally reached the bottom, she found herself in a small, windowless room. It was almost completely bare, save for a single wooden chest in the center of the floor. The chest was old, its wood warped and cracked with age. A thick, heavy padlock held it shut, but the key was nowhere to be found. Sarah knelt down beside the chest, her fingers tracing the rough surface. What could be inside? Her mind raced with possibilities. Treasure, secrets, maybe even something darker. The letters upstairs had hinted at a hidden secret, something that had caused fear and destruction. Could this chest hold the key to that mystery? Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room, searching for anything that could help her open the lock. But the room was empty, save for the chest. Frustrated, she stood up, wiping her dusty hands on her jeans. She couldn't open it now. But that didn't mean she would give up. There had to be a key somewhere in the house, and she was determined to find it. As Sarah climbed back up the stairs, her mind buzzed with questions. What was this place? Who was Eleanor, and what had happened to her? And what secrets were hidden inside that chest, locked away for so many years? The house seemed quieter now, almost as though it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Sarah knew one thing for sure. Whatever she had stumbled upon, it was bigger than she had imagined. And there was no turning back now. She would find the key. She would open the chest, and whatever secrets this house held, she would uncover them, no matter the cost. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something far more significant than a forgotten relic of the past. The weight of the chest's mystery gnawed at her thoughts, pulling her back again and again to the hidden room beneath the house. What was in there? Why had it been sealed away for so long? Her mind buzzed with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. After returning from the basement, Sarah spent hours combing through the rest of the house, searching for anything that might help her unlock the chest. But the house, for all its eeriness, gave up its secrets slowly. She found little else in the way of clues, a few scattered papers, some old family photos, and various odds and ends that had been left behind when the previous occupants abandoned the place. Each item seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle, but none of it made any sense yet. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floor, Sarah found herself back in the room with the letters. She sat down at the desk, staring at the old pages spread out before her. The handwriting was delicate, almost beautiful, but it was difficult to decipher the faded ink. She leaned in closer, squinting at the scrawled words, her fingers tracing the sentences as she tried to piece together the fragmented story. Dearest Eleanor, Crestwood is no longer safe. Our secret, they will come for us if they find out. The more Sarah read, the more she became convinced that whatever had happened to Eleanor and her family all those years ago had been shrouded in scandal and fear. The letters spoke of betrayal, of something hidden so deep that the family had been willing to erase any trace of it from the town's history. But who were they, And what had happened that was so terrible it had forced the family to flee their home and leave everything behind? Sarah's eyes drifted back to the mirror. The reflection of the room seemed almost distorted, as if the years of dust and decay had warped the glass itself. She stood up and walked over to it, wiping away more of the grime. For a moment, she stared at her reflection, wondering what Eleanor would have thought if she had known that, decades later, a stranger would be standing in her home, trying to unravel her life. Then, as Sarah's eyes adjusted to the clearer glass, something caught her attention in the reflection, a small glimmer just beneath the desk. Her pulse quickened as she knelt down to examine the floorboards. There, half hidden beneath the dust, was a loose board, slightly raised from the others. Sarah's fingers dug into the crevice, prying the board up with careful precision. Beneath it, she found a small ornate box, no larger than a jewelry case. It was covered in intricate carvings, symbols she didn't recognize, and the wood itself felt strange to the touch, as though it had been crafted from a material unlike anything she had ever seen. Her breath caught as she lifted the box into her hands. It was surprisingly light, and there was a small keyhole in the center of its face. Could this be the key she had been looking for? Her hands trembled as she gently turned the box over, searching for any indication of how to open it. She ran her fingers over the carvings, trying to make sense of the strange symbols. They seemed to shift beneath her touch, almost alive with movement, though she knew that couldn't be possible. She shook off the unease creeping up her spine and focused on the task at hand. It took her several minutes to find the hidden latch. It was tucked away in one of the carvings, so well concealed that it might have been missed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Sarah held her breath as she pressed down on the latch, and with a soft click, the lid of the box sprang open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was an old iron key. The sight of it made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The key was simple, unadorned, but something about it felt ancient, as if it had been made for a singular purpose long ago. She picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand, and a shiver ran down her spine. This had to be the key to the chest in the basement. Suddenly, everything seemed to fall into place. This house, this family, had been guarding something for generations, something they had hidden away, sealed beneath the floorboards and locked inside that chest. And now, after all these years, Sarah had been the one to find it. A part of her wanted to stop, to turn back before she uncovered something she couldn't handle. But another part of her, stronger, more desperate, was determined to see it through. She had to know. She had to find out what had been locked away for so long. The house felt colder as Sarah made her way back down to the basement, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides, as if the very walls of the house were closing in on her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. When she reached the bottom, the chest was waiting for her, just as she had left it. It sat in the center of the room, bathed in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. Sarah knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as she slid the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the lock disengaged. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. What was she about to uncover? She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside this chest had the power to change everything, her life, the town, maybe even more. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside, there were no gold coins, no treasures, no artifacts of great wealth. Instead, there were old, crumbling documents, tied together with brittle, faded ribbons. And at the very bottom of the chest, nestled among the papers, was a small, leather-bound book. Sarah reached for the book, her fingers trembling as she lifted it out of the chest. The leather was cracked and worn, but the pages inside seemed mostly intact. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the first page. What she found sent a shock of cold through her entire body. It was a journal, Eleanor's journal, and as Sarah flipped through the pages, the truth of what had happened all those years ago began to unravel before her eyes. The journal spoke of a dark secret, something that had been passed down through Eleanor's family for generations. A curse, some said. A terrible mistake, said others. Whatever it was, it had led to the ruin of the family, forcing them to abandon their home and leave everything behind. Eleanor's words were filled with desperation and fear. She had been forced to hide the truth, to protect her family from those who would seek to destroy them. But in doing so, she had trapped herself in a life of isolation, bound by the very secret she had sworn to protect. As Sarah read further, the journal revealed that the chest had once held more than just papers. It had also contained something else, something far more dangerous. But Eleanor had hidden it away, locking it in a place where no one would ever find it. Sarah's blood ran cold as she reached the final entry in the journal. "I fear it is too late," Eleanor had written. "They are coming for me now. The truth cannot remain hidden forever. But if you are reading this, if you have found the key, then you must know. The curse is real, and it will not rest until it has taken what it is owed." Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart racing. The air in the basement felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was closing in around her. She stuffed the journal into her bag, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. What had Eleanor meant? What curse? And what had been hidden away, waiting all these years for someone to find it? Suddenly, the shadows in the basement seemed darker, more menacing. The walls seemed to breathe, and the floor creaked ominously beneath her feet. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. She needed to get out of there. Without another glance at the chest, Sarah bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. The house seemed to groan around her as she raced through the dark hallways, the eerie silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She didn't stop until she was outside, standing in the cold evening air, her chest heaving with breath. The house loomed behind her, silent and foreboding, its windows like dark, empty eyes watching her every move. Sarah clutched the journal tightly to her chest, her mind spinning with questions. She had uncovered the secret of the house. But what now? The air outside the abandoned house felt strangely lighter, as if the suffocating atmosphere that had clung to Sarah inside the house had dissipated the moment she crossed its threshold. She stood in the fading light of the late afternoon, clutching Eleanor's journal against her chest, her heart still racing from her frantic escape. The ominous warnings written within the pages of the journal swirled in her mind, each word laced with fear, dread, and something she couldn't quite define. Maybe guilt. Sarah's fingers ran over the worn leather of the journal, the surface rough against her skin. She glanced back at the house, its darkened windows seeming to stare back at her, empty and cold. The house was just a shell, a place abandoned for years, but now it felt alive. An entity in its own right, harboring secrets that had been buried for generations. But it wasn't the house itself that unnerved Sarah the most. It was what she had found inside it. What Eleanor had written, the warnings, the talk of a curse, had felt surreal in the cold logic of daylight. But now, as dusk crept in, the weight of the journal's revelations settled heavily on her shoulders. Was the curse real? Sarah had never believed in the supernatural. She'd always been the kind of person who grounded herself in practical, tangible things. But this was something different. She had felt the heaviness of the house, the unshakable sense that something was watching her from the shadows. There was something more to this than just an old family secret. The wind picked up, rustling the trees that lined the forgotten property. Sarah shivered and turned her gaze away from the house, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as she started walking toward town. The familiar streets of Crestwood beckoned her, and despite her reluctance to face the people who would surely gossip about her every move, she knew she needed help. She couldn't deal with this on her own. But the question remained, who could she trust with this? She thought about the people she knew in town, the faces she passed every day. Some were kind, but most were indifferent. Crestwood was small, and the rumor mill worked at breakneck speed. If she went to anyone in town, they'd talk, and soon everyone would know. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet, but there was one person she could turn to, someone who might have the answers she needed. Jonathan Miller. He was Crestwood's resident historian, a quirky man in his late 40s who had lived in the town his whole life. He ran the small, dusty museum on the edge of town, a place filled with old relics and forgotten stories. Jonathan was the kind of person who knew everything about Crestwood's history, the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre. If anyone could help her make sense of what she had found, it was him. As she made her way through the quiet streets, the weight of the journal grew heavier in her hands. She passed familiar landmarks: the old library, the diner where she worked, the church steeple that rose above the town like a sentinel watching over its people. Everything seemed so normal, so unchanged. But for Sarah, nothing felt normal anymore. The secret she carried made her feel isolated, as if she were moving through a world that no longer belonged to her. By the time she reached the museum, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadows. The building was small and unassuming, its windows dark, save for a single light glowing faintly inside. Sarah hesitated at the door, taking a deep breath before knocking. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and there stood Jonathan, his thinning hair tousled and his glasses perched precariously on the edge of his nose. He peered at her curiously, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Sarah," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you here this late?" She offered a weak smile, clutching the journal tighter against her chest. I need your help, Jonathan. It's about the old house on the edge of town, the one everyone says is cursed." Jonathan's eyes widened at the mention of the house, and he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "The abandoned Carter house. I didn't think anyone went near that place anymore. What's going on?" Sarah stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of relief at being in the warm, cluttered space. The museum was filled with old photographs, artifacts from Crestwood's history, and stacks of books that Jonathan had collected over the years. It smelled of old paper and dust, a scent that somehow put Sarah at ease. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, she placed Eleanor's journal on the small table in front of Jonathan and said, "I found this in the house. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Carter. I think it's important, but I don't understand everything in it. There's talk of a curse, something hidden. I need to know if any of this is true." Jonathan's expression shifted from curiosity to something more serious. He pulled out a chair and sat down, carefully flipping through the pages of the journal. His eyes narrowed as he read, his lips pursing in concentration. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at Sarah, his face pale. "The Carter family. There's a lot of dark history there. They were one of the town's founding families, wealthy and influential. But then, sometime in the early 1900s, there was a scandal, something about a child born out of wedlock. The town was small back then, and people didn't take kindly to that sort of thing. Rumors spread about strange occurrences in the Carter house, whispers of a curse that had plagued the family for generations. But most of it was just that, rumors." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "But what about the curse?" Eleanor seemed convinced it was real. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "There's no concrete evidence of a curse, at least not in any historical records. But there are plenty of stories. The Carter family fell apart after that scandal. Eleanor disappeared, and no one knows what happened to her. The house was abandoned, and people started saying it was cursed because everyone who lived there after the Carters either left town or, well, worse. A few strange accidents, unexplained deaths. But it's hard to say what's true and what's just small-town superstition." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. "I found a chest in the basement, locked away. And I found the key. But when I opened it, all I found were papers and this journal." Eleanor said something about a hidden danger, something terrible that had been locked away. Jonathan's face grew even paler. If there's something hidden in that house, it might not just be a metaphor. The Carters were known for keeping secrets, dangerous ones. If Eleanor was trying to protect something or someone, it could have been much worse than a simple family scandal. The room seemed to grow colder as Jonathan's words hung in the air. Sarah's mind raced. What had Eleanor been trying to protect? And from whom? The idea of something more sinister lurking beneath the surface of Crestwood's history sent a chill down her spine. "Jonathan, what do I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I should keep digging, or if I'm opening something that's better left buried." Jonathan was silent for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "If what you found is connected to the Carter family's downfall, it could be dangerous. But at the same time, it might be the key to understanding the truth. The question is, are you ready to face whatever that truth is? Because once you uncover it, there's no going back." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had known, deep down, that this was more than just an old journal, more than a family's forgotten history. But hearing Jonathan say it out loud made the reality of the situation hit her even harder. The Carter family's secrets had been buried for a reason, and now she had become entangled in a mystery that had haunted the town for generations. "I need to know," she said quietly. "I need to know the truth." Jonathan nodded, standing up and grabbing a few books from the shelves behind him. "Then we'll find it. I'll help you. But we need to be careful. Whatever happened to Eleanor, and to the people who came after her, wasn't just coincidence. There's more to this than meets the eye." As Jonathan spread out the old maps and documents of Crestwood, tracing the Carter family's lineage and influence, Sarah felt a strange mix of dread and excitement. She was about to uncover something that had been hidden for decades, maybe even centuries. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one thing became clear. There was something in that house that was never meant to be found. And Sarah had already crossed a line she could never uncross. As she sat there, watching Jonathan pore over the town's records, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been waiting in that house for all these years was far from done with her. The curse, or whatever it was real. And now it was awake. The days that followed were a blur of mounting tension and growing uncertainty. Sarah spent most of her time at the small, cluttered museum with Jonathan, poring over old town records, family trees, and the fading memories of a town long past its prime. Every document they uncovered only deepened the mystery, each one painting a picture of a family that had been revered, feared, and ultimately destroyed by something far more insidious than scandal or shame. Crestwood had always been a town of secrets, but the Carter family's secret was different. It was ancient, older than the town itself, and woven into the very fabric of the community. It was something that had been hidden for generations, and Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her more heavily with each passing day. The journal was never far from her side. She carried it with her like a talisman, constantly flipping through the pages, hoping she had missed something that would unlock the truth. Eleanor's words were becoming an obsession. Sarah felt a strange connection to the long-dead woman, someone who had been caught in the grip of a family curse, desperately trying to protect her loved ones, while losing everything in the process. And now Sarah was beginning to feel as though she was following the same path, stepping deeper and deeper into the dark history of Crestwood. Jonathan had been invaluable. His knowledge of the town's history was encyclopedic, and he had a particular interest in the Carter family. As they worked side by side in the dim light of the museum, he shared stories and rumors he had heard as a child, strange happenings that people dismissed as superstition, but now seemed to hold some uncomfortable truths. There had been whispers about the Carter family for as long as anyone could remember, stories of strange accidents, sudden deaths, and people who disappeared without a trace. The family had been powerful, wealthy, and influential, but their downfall had been swift and brutal. After the scandal involving Eleanor and the illegitimate child, everything had spiraled out of control. The family had retreated into their grand estate, shunned by the town, and it wasn't long before the tragedies began. Jonathan showed Sarah a series of old newspaper clippings, the headlines grim and foreboding. Tragedy strikes Carter estate. Young boy found dead in mysterious circumstances. Prominent family member found drowned in river. Foul play suspected. Another Carter family death raises questions of family curse. Each article detailed a different death, each one stranger and more unsettling than the last. In some cases, there were witnesses who claimed to have seen shadowy figures around the Carter estate, figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Others spoke of a strange illness that seemed to plague the family, one that doctors couldn't explain. Sarah couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine as she read the accounts. It was as if the family had been systematically wiped out, one by one, until no one was left. And then the house had been abandoned, left to rot at the edge of town, taking its secrets with it, but not all of them. "What do you think happened to Eleanor?" Sarah asked one evening as they sifted through another box of old records. Jonathan glanced up, his eyes tired but thoughtful. "I think Eleanor was the last one who knew the truth," he said. "Whatever this curse is, or was, she was the one who tried to stop it. But I don't think she succeeded." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. But what is it? What could be so terrible that it would destroy an entire family? Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked over to a bookshelf, pulling down a thick, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed with age. He flipped through it until he found the page he was looking for, then handed it to Sarah. She stared at the page, her eyes widening. It was an old legend, something that had been passed down through the generations, but was largely forgotten. The legend spoke of a pact made long ago, between the founders of Crestwood and something far older, something darker. The details were vague, but the story hinted at a ritual, a sacrifice that had to be made to ensure the town's prosperity, and it had been the Carter family who had borne the weight of that sacrifice. As Sarah read, her breath caught in her throat. The words on the page felt like a revelation and a warning. The Carters had been chosen. Chosen to keep the town safe. Chosen to pay the price. But somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. The family had turned against one another, and the curse, whatever it was, had consumed them. She slammed the book shut, her heart racing. "So you're saying the Carter family made a deal with something, and that's what destroyed them?" Jonathan sighed, sitting down heavily in his chair. "It's not as simple as that. These kinds of legends are always twisted by time. But I do think the Carters were tied to something they couldn't escape. And Eleanor, well, she tried to break the chain, but she failed. And now, you're in the middle of it." Sarah's head spun. She had never believed in curses, in deals with dark forces, or any of the supernatural. But the weight of everything she had uncovered was impossible to ignore. The deaths, the strange occurrences, the journal, it all pointed to something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now she was tangled in it, a modern-day Eleanor facing the same fate as the woman who had come before her. The museum suddenly felt too small, too claustrophobic. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "I don't understand why this is happening. I didn't ask for this. I don't have anything to do with the Carters." Jonathan watched her, his face drawn with worry. "You may not be a Carter, but you've stumbled upon their secret. And now, whatever it is, whatever was tied to them, knows you're not just some passerby anymore, Sarah. You've become part of the story." Sarah's chest tightened with fear. The truth of his words hung in the air, undeniable. She had crossed a line the moment she entered that house, and now there was no going back. But what terrified her most was the realization that she wasn't sure she wanted to turn back. There was a part of her, a small, desperate part, that needed to know the truth, even if it meant facing whatever dark force had plagued the Carter family. "I need to go back," she said suddenly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I need to go back to the house. There's something I missed, something that might explain all of this." Jonathan stood, concern etched on his face. "Sarah, I don't think that's a good idea. If the legends are true, if the curse is real, Then going back there could be dangerous. I know, she said quietly, but I can't stop now. I need to know what happened to Eleanor. I need to know if there's a way to break this. Jonathan hesitated, then nodded slowly. If you're going back, I'm coming with you. We'll face it together. As the two of them gathered their things and prepared to leave, Sarah felt a sense of dread settle over her. The house was waiting for her, its dark presence looming in the back of her mind. She had no idea what she would find when she returned, but one thing was certain: whatever had destroyed the Carters wasn't done yet, and now it had set its sights on her. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sky had darkened, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. The wind howled through the trees, and the old Carter estate stood silhouetted against the night, its windows dark and lifeless. But as Sarah and Jonathan approached, a strange feeling washed over her, an overwhelming sense that the house was watching, waiting for her return. They stood at the gate for a moment, staring up at the looming structure. Then, without a word, Sarah pushed open the rusted gate, and together, they stepped into the shadows. The house welcomed them with a silence that felt like a warning. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had come too far to turn back now. As Sarah and Jonathan stepped into the oppressive silence of the Carter estate, the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The house loomed ahead, its dark windows reflecting the faint light of the moon, as if it were staring back at them with unseen eyes. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that seemed unnatural, as though the very atmosphere around the house had frozen in anticipation. The rusted gate clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing through the night like a final, ominous warning. Jonathan walked beside Sarah, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a quiet tension. He clutched a flashlight in one hand, the beam of light cutting through the darkness as they made their way toward the front door. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of Eleanor's journal pressing against her side in her jacket pocket. She had returned to this place because she needed answers, but as they approached the front door, she couldn't help but wonder if there were some truths better left buried. The door creaked open with a groan, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness of the night. Inside, the house was exactly as she had left it, dusty, decaying, and filled with a strange, lingering presence. But now it felt different. The air was colder, thicker, and every shadow seemed to shift just out of the corner of her eye. Sarah swallowed hard, glancing at Jonathan, who gave her a nod of reassurance before stepping inside. They moved carefully through the darkened hallways, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The house felt like a labyrinth, its walls closing in around them, the silence only broken by the distant sound of the wind outside. Sarah's eyes flicked to the familiar rooms she had explored before, but tonight they seemed even more menacing, as if the house itself had been waiting for her to return. "It feels different," Jonathan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "like it knows we're here." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She had felt it too. The house wasn't just empty. It was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. As they made their way deeper into the house, Sarah felt the pull toward the basement where the chest had been. It was as though an invisible force was guiding her steps, leading her back to the place where this nightmare had begun. They descended the rickety staircase, the darkness swallowing them whole, until they reached the small room at the bottom. The chest sat in the middle of the room, just as it had before, but now it felt more ominous, like an artifact of some ancient power. Sarah knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she placed the journal on the floor beside her. She had already opened the chest, but something told her that the key to unlocking the Carter family's curse lay within the journal, and in something she had yet to discover. She could feel it, an answer just out of reach, waiting to be unearthed. Jonathan stood behind her, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls as Sarah flipped through the journal's pages once more. She skimmed over Eleanor's desperate words, searching for anything she had missed, something that would make sense of the chaos that had destroyed the Carter family and was now threatening her own life. And then, just as she was about to give up, she found it. hidden in the final entry, a passage she had previously overlooked in her haste. "I write this with trembling hands, for I fear I have made a terrible mistake," Eleanor had written. "The curse cannot be undone by simply sealing it away. It grows stronger in the darkness, waiting for a new host to give it life. I tried to bind it, to keep it locked within the walls of this house, but it is clever, far more clever than I ever imagined. And now, I know the truth. It was not our family's sin that cursed us. It was a promise made long ago, a deal struck by those who sought power beyond the veil of death. And that power must be paid in blood." Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the words aloud to Jonathan, her voice shaking. "A promise made long ago," she whispered. "It wasn't just a family scandal. It was something else, something darker." Jonathan's face paled as he processed the words. A deal? For what? What kind of deal would curse an entire family like this? Sarah shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know. But if Eleanor is right, then whatever it was, it's still here. It's still waiting." The room felt colder, the walls pressing in on them. Sarah could feel the weight of the curse now, as if it were a living thing, breathing in the shadows around them. She had thought that finding the chest would reveal the answers, but now she realized that the chest had only been the beginning. The true source of the curse had never been sealed away. It had been waiting for someone to uncover it, someone to bring it back to life. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, casting the room into brief darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as she turned toward Jonathan. His face was tense, his eyes wide with fear. "The batteries," he said, his voice low. They were new. The light flickered again, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Sarah's pulse raced as she fumbled for her phone, but before she could turn on the flashlight, a sound echoed through the basement, a low, whispering voice, so soft it was almost imperceptible. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping itself around them like a suffocating mist. "Blood must be paid." Sarah's heart stopped. She turned toward Jonathan, but his expression told her he had heard it too. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to seep into their very bones. "We need to get out of here," Jonathan said, his voice barely controlled. "Now." But as they turned toward the stairs, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the whispering became a cacophony, swirling around them like a storm. Sarah's legs felt heavy, as though she were wading through thick, invisible water. The house was alive, and it was trying to keep them inside. Suddenly, something cold brushed against Sarah's arm, and she gasped, stumbling backward. It was as if the shadows themselves had reached out, trying to pull her deeper into the darkness. Jonathan grabbed her arm, pulling her upright, his face pale with fear. "We're not alone," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We need to move." But the room felt impossibly large now, the exit further away than it had been just moments before. Sarah could feel the presence growing stronger, closing in around them. She clutched Eleanor's journal tightly, the only thing that felt real in the swirling chaos. And then, in a flash of understanding, she realized what the curse was. It wasn't just a family curse, it was a living force, something that had been born from the deal Eleanor's ancestors had made. A force that had fed on the blood of the Carter family for generations, growing stronger with each life it took. And now, it wanted her. "We can't leave," Sarah said suddenly, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not yet." Jonathan looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "We have to get out of here." "No," Sarah said, stepping toward the chest. "If we leave, it'll just keep growing stronger. It'll find someone else. We have to finish what Eleanor started." Jonathan hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. "How?" Sarah opened the chest again, her fingers brushing over the brittle papers inside. "Eleanor tried to seal it away, but she didn't destroy it. There has to be a way." The whispering grew louder, the shadows pressing closer. Sarah felt the weight of the curse, a cold, suffocating presence that seemed to wrap itself around her heart. But she didn't back down. She had come too far to turn back now. And then, in the corner of the chest, she found it, a small, ancient blade, barely more than a sliver of metal. It was worn and rusted, but as Sarah picked it up, she felt a strange warmth spread through her fingers. This was it. This was what Eleanor had used to bind the curse. But it wasn't enough to bind it. It had to be destroyed. Sarah turned to Jonathan, her eyes fierce. "We have to end this." Without waiting for a response, she moved toward the shadows, the blade clutched tightly in her hand. The whispering rose to a fever pitch, and the darkness seemed to writhe around her. But she didn't stop. She raised the blade high, her heart pounding in her chest. "For Eleanor," she whispered, "for all of them." And with a single decisive strike, she drove the blade into the center of the room, where the shadows were thickest. The whispering stopped. The air grew still, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the darkness began to recede, the weight of the curse lifting from the room like a dissipating fog. Sarah fell to her knees, exhausted but alive. The house, once so full of malevolent energy, felt empty. Still, the curse was broken. Jonathan knelt beside her, his face pale but relieved. "It's over," he whispered. Sarah nodded, too drained to speak. She had done it. They had done it. The Carter family's curse, the deal that had doomed them all, was finally destroyed. But as